Sometimes it seems Bethesda can do no wrong. To be very clear here, I'm not talking about their marketing, I'm not talking about the quality of their games, I'm not even talking about the player feedback. No, I'm talking about the simplest measurement of all, numbers. And game after game, Bethesda just keep seeming to, rack up the numbers higher and higher. No matter what they say or what they do, people keep playing and talking about their games. And yes, I know what you're saying, what about Fallout 76? Well, I think that is probably the exception that proves the rule. Despite all the bonkers stuff that went on with that game, interest in Bethesda games is still absolutely massive. Now, I'm not just referring to player numbers here, but also to the sheer size of the game's community. I mean, just look at the numbers of active people on the Starfield subreddit. I mean, look, 27,000 people online. That is absolutely crazy numbers and far outstrips virtually any other game sub out there. Then again, maybe the reality is that this is all about space, and more specifically, spaceships. And talking of spaceships, here's a word from today's sponsor, Pixel Starships 2. Pixel Starships is a space game that many of you may recognise. Available on both PC and mobile, this sci-fi strategy game has garnered a community of over 10 million players. Savvy Soda then, the developers are charting a course for a sequel set to launch onto Kickstarter on the 26th of September. In this new and improved version of the game, Pixel Starships 2 offers a deeper dive into starship management in an MMO setting. The choices are vast, trade, battle, or simply explore. The game's essence lies in its strategy and exploration. Whether you lean towards covert operations or direct confrontations, the universe will adapt to your playstyle. With a revamped game engine, the experience promises more depth and immersion. It's an evolution, not just a sequel. For those interested, the Kickstarter link is below. Pixel Starships 2 aims to redefine its genre. It's a journey through the stars, waiting for captains, ready to chart into the unknown. So what makes Starfield such a numbers-generating beast? After all, let's be real here. Starfield has certainly had a mixed reception. A lot of people certainly like it, but equally there's a whole bunch of people out there who are not that impressed, and that is an understatement to say the least. Now recently, Todd Howard gave an interview on the Game Maker's Notebook podcast. He was interviewed by Ted Price of Insomniac Games, who, by the way, have made some exceptional games themselves. The Spider-Man series immediately comes to mind. And on this podcast, on this interview, there was a few things that I really want to touch on when it comes to, the interview itself, and it does give us some insight into just why Bethesda titles might have a massive following. Also want to return to this subject again in a future video where I'll go into more details on my own personal thoughts for this subject. And just to be clear, none of this video is about me discussing the quality of Starfield. Again, that is a subject I want to come back to at a later date. Today, we're going to simply look at why Bethesda has such a massive following, at least based on what we can determine from some of this interview. Now, before we get into that interview, here's a few more Starfield numbers and stats. At the last count, Microsoft revealed that 10 million players have so far played Starfield. Meanwhile, over on Steam, player numbers are holding very well, maintaining a 24-hour peak of close to 100,000 players. That is really good for a single-player game. Over on YouTube, the number of Starfield videos published per day is also consistently high, with a lot of views as well. Twitch, though, tells a very different story. Viewer numbers there are relatively low on the gaming streaming giant. So then, why is it that Bethesda games have such a large following? Could it be to do with the scale of their games? In the interview, Ted Price asked Todd Howard about this. Games in general have been getting ever bigger and increasingly more complex over recent years. So who does this really start with? Is it down to the players or is it something else?
Well, I think it starts with the developers. I mean, it has to, right?
Yeah, true. We do.
And I think it starts with technology. You're seeing new hardware. You're wanting to use it in new ways. You're looking at demos like, oh, we could do this, we could do this, we could present it in this way. The scale of games, I think, is I'd have to go back and look, Ted, to be honest, like, okay, how big were things before? The one thing I have noticed is because more games are played for a long time, they're live, that the ability to update them over time creates games that people are playing right now that have been around for a long time. They've gotten years and years and years of updates. And that creates an expectation when I'm going into something new. How does this compare with a mature game that I've been playing for a while?
Now, there's certainly some good insights in that particular statement, but I'm not convinced that it really answers the question about the appeal of Bethesda's games specifically. I mean, think about all these single-player games that you've ever played over the years. How many of them were updated and improved over time? If we stick to relatively modern times, some of my favourite and most memorable single-player games are the Bioshock series, Mass Effect, Uncharted 4, multiple Legend of Zelda games, and certainly far more. God of War is another one. None of these have really had any significant content updates or would be what I consider to be games that are live. Then again, if we're talking about The Witcher 3, another game that I really do like, then the story there is a bit different. That game has been improved numerous times over the years, and with each release the update does freshen its appeal. Witcher 3 I think perhaps could be considered to be the one that has the longest lifespan there in terms of the most amount of player numbers, ongoing player numbers. So just maybe there is a bit of truth to that. This is why Bethesda games have that long-term appeal. Now, another thought is that Bethesda game worlds have always been reactive and alive. They feel lived in, but also feel as though they draw me into their world. Starfield feels somewhat different with that, and that's something I'm going to talk about in the future. But I do think this is a large part of the appeal to Bethesda games. But it doesn't really explain why Skyrim is still highly played 12 years after its release. Like we say, it's not the only game worlds that feel lived in. Witcher is another really good example. But when asked about this subject in regards to Starfield, Todd said this.
I think if you look at your audience, they get used to a game and they usually want to plus one it. They want to add X, Y, and Z. And the developers usually do, we do as well, right? We want to say, okay, we want to add this. So even Starfield, as we're looking at now, we're looking at feedback. We have a big list here of here's all the things that we want to add to the game. And everybody wants to do it right away. And what we know, like, okay, let's pick our battles. Let's make sure everything's really solid because this is a game. And it's intentionally made to be played for a long time. It's one of the things we've learned from our previous games, from the Skyrim, from Fallout, that people want to play them for a very long time. So Starfield, I would say, was the most intentional going into it. This is a game people are going to play for a long time. How do we build it such that it is allowing that in a way that feels natural? And if people have played the game and if you finish the main quest, et cetera, you can see that. But it's also one where, okay, what does Starfield look like in 3 months? What does it look like in 6 months? What's it like in a year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years?
So we've known for a while that modding was always planned to be a big deal for Starfield. And whilst the official creation kit tools won't be released until next year, this hasn't stopped people from releasing hundreds, if not thousands of mods for the game so far. A lot of them you can see over on the Nexus Mods website. Unfortunately, they're all, for the moment at least, for PC only. And this explains, in part at least, why games such as Skyrim have such long legs. Why over a decade after release people still play the game. But it doesn't really explain the massive current interest in Starfield. After all, at just a few weeks old, the game is still very early on in its lifespan. So ultimately, whilst the interview with Todd Howard gives plenty of insight into the thought process behind Bethesda's games and Starfield, it doesn't really provide a satisfying answer to my initial question. In terms of numbers and player interest, it just seems that Bethesda can do no wrong. And why is this? They have an inbuilt fan base that absolutely adores their games and will turn out in droves for them. So, as I mentioned, I have my own thoughts on Starfield, its quality, its ambitions, and many other things besides, and this is something I want to talk about in depth in another video. But I thought it was going to be very important to get this particular issue out of the way first. As, I feel to a large extent the player interest in Starfield is a very different subject to the quality and nature of Starfield itself. Or maybe you disagree with me on that one. Do let me know in the comment section what you feel about that. Meanwhile, I'd like to once again thank Pixel Starships 2 for sponsoring this video. If you want to know more about that game's newest project, do check out the link in the video description below. It will contain everything you need to know about the game and the plans for it, so yeah, do take a look. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys and girls next time.